In March 1984, a father walked into his daughter's home in Houston, Texas, and made a devastating discovery. Decades later, CODIS would bring a breakthrough. Aileen Kennedy was born on January 22, 1951, to parents Charles Chambers Kennedy Jr. and Elrose Lillie Kennedy. Aileen would eventually become a creative and hardworking woman, pursuing several ventures that showed her artistic and entrepreneurial spirit. She ran a small business focused on antique and used clothing, finding value in vintage pieces and collecting them for her customers. Alongside this, she operated a retail used clothing store, expanding her reach in the local community. Aileen's interests did not stop there. She also created custom jewelry and built a reputation as an interior decorator. Her specialty was in stained glass decor. Aileen was not an only child. She had two siblings, one of whom was her younger sister, Lillie Kennedy. Lillie was born in 1961, 10 years after Aileen, but Lillie's own path unfolded differently from Aileen's. By the age of 23, she was unemployed. Earlier in her working life, she had taken a job as a key punch operator. The two sisters lived together in Houston, Texas. Their home was located in the Heights neighborhood, a residential area known for its older houses and distinct charm. They shared a blue and white house at 600 East 12th Street. On March 5, 1984, tragedy struck the Kennedy family. That day, their dad made a horrific discovery when he entered his daughter's home in the Heights neighborhood. He found his two adult daughters, 33-year-old Aileen and 23-year-old Lillie, lying dead on the floor. The shocking scene left him no choice but to immediately alert the authorities. The police arrived at the residence quickly after receiving the call. When the officers entered the home, they confirmed what their dad had already discovered. Both sisters' lives were brutally taken in what was clearly a violent attack. At the scene, the investigators noted that each victim had suffered gunshot wounds, making it clear that firearms had been used. The younger of the two, Lillie, had been shot in the back of the head. The wound was fatal and caused her life to end quickly. In contrast, her sister, Aileen, had endured far greater suffering at the hands of the criminal. The autopsy later revealed that Aileen had not only been shot, but had also been stabbed and beaten with something heavy. In addition to this, she had been assaulted. As the investigators examined the crime scene, it became clear that the home had been ransacked, items were missing, and the police determined that property had been taken. This pointed to the possibility of robbery as part of the motive, though the extent of violence inflicted on Aileen suggested far more than a simple burglary gone wrong. During the course of the investigation, the detectives spoke with neighbors hoping to gather more information. One neighbor reported seeing a man leaving the house on the day of the crime. The man was carrying a duffel bag, raising the neighbors' suspicions that a burglary might have been happening. When confronted, the stranger explained that his wife had kicked him out of the home. Accepting the explanation, the neighbor allowed the man to leave. Despite the leads, the investigators struggled to make progress. They conducted an extensive investigation, pursuing every angle available at the time. Yet no suspects were identified and no arrests were made. As a result, the case would remain unsolved and growing cold and dormant for decades. Cold case investigators looked at the case again in 2009, 25 years after the brutal crime had first gone cold. Using evidence preserved from Aileen's assault examination, they were able to extract a DNA profile. This profile was then submitted to CODIS. Despite the effort, no matches were identified, and the case once again slowed to a standstill. Investigation remained stuck until late 2014, another 5 years later, when an unexpected lead came up. A man who was facing charges in an unrelated matter came forward with information connected to the Kennedy case. He identified an individual named Edmund Dugan as a potential suspect. This tip gave the investigators a new direction and renewed hope that justice might finally be within reach. The detectives soon discovered that Dugan was still living in the Houston area. With this knowledge, they moved to obtain forensic evidence directly from him. The DNA collected from Dugan was entered into CODIS, where it was matched against the evidence preserved from the Kennedy crime scene. The results confirmed what the investigators suspected. Dugan's DNA was a direct match to the evidence connected to the case. In January 2015, the authorities arrested him, and he was formally charged. His trial focused on killing Aileen, and in 2017, the court reached a verdict. Dugan was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. An HPD sergeant later explained that Dugan had actually been questioned back in 1984, shortly after the crime took place, but at that time he was not considered a suspect. Although the conviction provided some measure of accountability, the outcome left the Kennedy family devastated once again. Due to Texas's mandatory release law, which allows inmates to earn early release based on good behavior credits, Dugan was freed from prison far earlier than expected. On December 1, 2021, after serving only 7 years of his 15-year sentence, Dugan walked free. The release was a painful blow to the sisters' loved ones. Their niece Ellie, along with other family members, expressed deep pain that the man convicted of such a violent crime would serve so little time. The Kennedy sisters were laid to rest in Hallettsville, Texas. At their father's request, their tombstones were engraved with the word "murdered," a permanent reminder of the violence that ended their lives and the injustice their family continued to endure. In July 1973, a woman was brutally attacked. Despite the broad daylight assault and mounting evidence, the case went unsolved for nearly 3 decades. Concetta Serra was born on March 2, 1952 in New Haven, Connecticut, to Italian-American parents John and Pauline Serra. Her childhood took a difficult turn when her mother passed away in 1963, leaving her to take on responsibilities beyond her years. At just 11 years old, Penny stepped into the role of homemaker, caring for her younger sister, Rosemary, and supporting her father in keeping the household together. Her sense of responsibility extended beyond the home. Penny also helped her father with the daily operations of his auto repair shop, including bookkeeping and other business tasks. During her teenage years, Penny attended Wilbur Cross High School. Her plans for the future were modest but hopeful, as her 1971 yearbook entry listed her next step simply as college. Although college was her goal, Penny chose to delay that path to support herself financially. By 1973, she had taken a job as a dental assistant at a practice on Chapel Street in New Haven. In her personal life, Penny became engaged to Philip DiLeo, who worked at his family's luncheonette near her workplace. The engagement, however, was troubled. Their relationship was marked by disagreements and difficulties that ultimately led Penny to end it. Despite this, the bond between them did not fully break. They continued to remain close, spending time together even after the engagement had been called off. On July 16, 1973, 21-year-old Penny drove her father's 1971 blue Buick Electra to work. She parked in the Temple Street parking garage, a structure just a few blocks away from her workplace. It was a busy weekday with people moving in and out of the garage, yet what was about to happen would leave the city shaken. Around noon, shortly after parking her car, Penny was suddenly approached by a man inside the garage. Without warning, he attacked her with a knife, stabbing at her multiple times in a violent struggle. In a desperate attempt to escape, she staggered toward her father's vehicle, but collapsed beside it, her injuries proving fatal. A parking attendant and several drivers soon came across the horrifying scene. Penny was lying on the concrete floor in a pool of her own blood, her life already slipping away due to one stab in the heart. Emergency responders were quickly called to the garage, but despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead before medical aid could reach her. The authorities wasted no time in launching an investigation. The police began collecting statements and searching for witnesses who might shed light on the broad daylight assault. Several eyewitnesses came forward, reporting that they had seen a man chasing Penny toward the stairwell. Others recalled observing a man fleeing the area, driving a Buick erratically through the garage shortly after the attack. Physical evidence soon emerged, pointing to the attacker's attempt to escape. Blood was discovered both on the exterior and interior of a 1972 Buick registered to Penny's father. The vehicle had been abandoned on the 8th floor of the garage, with a bloody trail leading up to the 9th floor. The discovery suggested the attacker had moved quickly through the levels in an effort to avoid capture. The investigators continued their search, uncovering more disturbing clues. A box of tissues smeared with bloody finger marks was found inside the car, lying in the footwell behind the driver's seat. On the 9th floor of the garage, the police discovered a hairpiece belonging to Penny, further connecting the struggle to the crime scene. The investigators examined several potential suspects over the years, but each lead eventually collapsed under closer scrutiny. Her former fiancé came under suspicion early on, but he was cleared after investigators determined his blood type did not match the samples taken from the crime scene. In 1984, another suspect, Anthony Galino, was arrested after his wife made statements implicating him, and the authorities noticed a scar on his hand. For a time, it appeared the investigators might finally have their answer. However, Galino was eventually ruled out when tests confirmed his blood type also failed to match the attackers. The case once again stalled. Not long after, suspicion shifted to a man named Selman Topsiu, whose accent and similar license plate drew police attention. Despite the circumstantial details, the evidence was not strong enough to secure a warrant, and he was never charged. Each of these false leads only deepened the frustration surrounding the case, leaving Penny's family without closure. In 1987, 14 years after the crime, the investigation received new energy when John, Penny's father, personally urged the state's attorney's office to take control of the case. This decision led to a detailed reenactment of the events inside the Temple Street parking garage, giving the investigators a clearer picture of how the attack had unfolded. Through this exercise, along with updated forensic analysis, they concluded the assault likely began on the 7th floor and that the attacker had injured his left hand during the struggle. A decade later, technological advancements finally provided the long-awaited breakthrough. In 1997, the investigators revisited a key piece of evidence, a tissue box found inside the abandoned Buick. A latent fingerprint lifted from the box was run through the state's automated fingerprint identification system, which had only recently become available. The print matched Edward R. Grant, a 59-year-old auto mechanic from Waterbury, Connecticut, who had been fingerprinted following a 1994 domestic violence arrest. On June 24, 1997, Grant was arrested. The fingerprint evidence, combined with the fact that Grant had type O blood, the same type found at the crime scene, strengthened the case against him. Further DNA testing of material recovered from Penny's clothing, which had been inconclusive in earlier years, later confirmed Grant's connection to the crime. The investigators also noted that he had no prior relationship or known contact with Penny, making the act all the more senseless and shocking. In 2002, nearly 3 decades after Penny's life was ended, Edward Grant finally faced trial. The courtroom proceedings drew considerable attention, as the case had remained one of New Haven's most haunting unsolved crimes for years. The trial centered on the crucial forensic breakthroughs that had connected Grant to the crime scene. The prosecution presented the fingerprint recovered from the tissue box inside the Buick, which had been conclusively matched to Grant through AFIS. They also highlighted the DNA analysis from Penny's clothing, which further reinforced the case against him. Together, these pieces of evidence created what the prosecutors described as an overwhelming link between Grant and the murder. Grant's defense, however, sought to undermine the credibility of the investigation. They questioned the handling of evidence over the decades and suggested that police errors or even tampering could have influenced the results. Despite these claims, the defense did not directly dispute the scientific validity of the fingerprint or DNA analysis, acknowledging the strength of the forensic findings. On September 27, 2002, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Grant was sentenced to a prison term of 20 years to life. Grant, then 59 years old, swayed as if he had been hit when he heard the word guilty. But a few feet behind him in the courtroom, Rosemary, Penny's sister, wept as she absorbed the news. During the sentencing hearing, Penny's cousin, Joseph Serra, spoke on behalf of the family. His words captured the deep pain that had weighed on them since her death. He told the court that Grant had stolen Penny from John, his first daughter, emphasizing the personal devastation the crime had caused. For the family, the trial's outcome offered closure, though it could never undo their loss. The police authorities also addressed the conclusion of the case. They expressed that after decades of frustration and dead ends, justice had finally been delivered for Penny. It is assumed that Grant wanted to steal the car as it was new and desirable at the time. Henry C. Lay, the nationally known forensic science investigator who along with many others helped to finally solve the case, recalled during an interview, "John Serra came to me a couple of times. He said, 'Dr. Lay, you are our last hope.'" Lee also recalled his final conversation with John in 1998 when he was terminally ill in the hospital. "He called me from the hospital and said, 'Please do not forget my daughter.' I told him, 'We are working very hard on the case. Nobody will forget Penny.'" In October 1999, a 4-year-old girl went missing during a short train ride between 2 villages in Belarus, Europe. The case would be solved decades later thanks to an online article about a missing person case. Yulia Moisenko was born in 1995, the daughter of Viktor and Lyudmila Moisenko, who raised her in Belarus. Yulia's life appeared to be that of an ordinary child until tragedy struck at an age far too young. In October 1999, Viktor took his daughter on a short train ride between villages in Belarus. It was meant to be a simple trip, nothing unusual or out of the ordinary. The father and daughter boarded the train, and during the ride, Viktor had a drink and eventually drifted off to sleep. While he slept, time passed quietly inside the train. But when he finally woke up, everything was drastically different. He was startled to find himself covered in blood. Even more horrifying was the realization that his young daughter was no longer by his side. Panic set in immediately as Viktor understood the situation. The shock of waking up in such a state, combined with his daughter's disappearance, left him with no time to waste. Without delay, he reported what had happened to the police. His first priority was to ensure that the authorities were alerted to his missing child. The police wasted no time in beginning their investigation. With Viktor's report in hand, they launched efforts to locate Yulia and uncover what had happened on that train ride. From that point forward, the search for Yulia became the central focus as the investigators tried to piece together the tragic mystery. At the start of the investigation, the police looked closely at Yulia's father. Given the circumstances, his clothes stained with blood and his lack of memory, the suspicion initially fell on him. However, forensic testing cleared him. A DNA test on the blood covering his clothing proved that it did not belong to Yulia, ruling out the theory that he had harmed his daughter. Despite being cleared, Viktor could provide little help to the investigators. He admitted that he could not remember if he had been in a fight or how the blood ended up on his clothes. He also had no memory of the crucial moments in which his daughter disappeared. With so few answers, the investigators were left with more questions than before. Alarmed by the disturbing case, the police expanded their efforts beyond the local villages. A widespread search mission was launched across the country. Teams were sent out, leads were followed, and attention was focused on train stations and rural areas. Still, no sign of the missing 4-year-old could be found. The trail grew cold and the mystery deepened. While official searches struggled, Yulia's mother, Lyudmila, refused to give up. She continued her search on her own, handing out posters with her daughter's photo at train stations. Her efforts were tireless and persistent, but despite her determination, no valuable information came up. The lack of progress left the family in anguish. That same year, a possible breakthrough appeared hundreds of miles away. 2 policemen in neighboring Russia discovered an abandoned 4-year-old girl at a train station in the city of Ryazan, located almost 1,000 kilometers from Minsk. The girl was unable to provide a full account of her past, but recalled one important detail. She remembered that her mother's name was Lyuda and her father's name was Viktor. Those few words were the only clues the Russian police had about her origins. Unable to trace her biological family with such limited information, the girl's case took a different path. She was placed with a Russian family, Irina Alpatova and her husband, who formally adopted her. From that point forward, she was raised as part of their household. While her biological parents remained untraceable, Irina was a pharmacist from Ryazan. When her younger son was born with serious health problems, she made a promise to adopt one child if he survived. He did, and the thankful mother had to fulfill her oath. 2 years later, the Moisenko family moved from their old house that was located close to a train station. Lyudmila Miller said, "I could no longer watch the trains. We moved to a place that had no train station anywhere near." In the years following Yulia's disappearance, her parents, Viktor and Lyudmila Miller, searched frantically for answers. In their late 50s, they continued to live under the weight of suspicion as many believed they might have been involved in their daughter's disappearance. Local police, who had initially been unable to solve the case, also turned their focus back on the parents, suspecting foul play despite the lack of concrete evidence. For a long time, the Moisenkos carried both grief and stigma. They not only lived without their child, but also endured the painful implication that they could have harmed her. Although they had maintained their innocence from the beginning, the lack of progress in the investigation left the case clouded by doubt. In 2017, nearly 2 decades after Yulia vanished, the case was officially reopened by the police. Modern investigative approaches were applied, and both Viktor and Lyudmila Miller agreed to undergo lie detector tests. Each of them passed, reinforcing what they had insisted all along, that they were not responsible for their daughter's disappearance. The breakthrough that would change everything came in 2019. By this time, Yulia was 24 years old and living in Russia. her boyfriend, Ilya Kyukov, began to search online for information connected to her past. In doing so, he came across details about a missing child case that had striking similarities to Yulia's own life story. Curiosity turned into action, and soon the connection between Yulia and the Moisenko family was tested scientifically. A DNA examination was conducted to determine whether the young woman was indeed the same child who had disappeared from Belarus in 1999. The results confirmed the truth. Yulia was Viktor and Lyudmila's biological daughter. The long-awaited reunion took place at a police station in Majelna Gora, a settlement in Belarus. It was there that Yulia and her biological parents saw each other again for the first time since her disappearance 2 decades earlier. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, a moment that words could barely capture. Yulia recalled, "We were all in tears. The overwhelming flood of emotions left them unable to speak." Instead, the family clung to each other, letting years of separation melt away in silence. For Yulia, it was the physical closeness that mattered most, the reassurance of finally being back in the arms of her parents. As they embraced, Viktor and Lyudmila shared what they had carried in their hearts for years. They told Yulia that they had never stopped searching, never abandoned the hope that they would one day find her. Their unwavering belief had been their strength during the decades of uncertainty. Lyudmila, overcome with joy, could not let go of her daughter. She hugged Yulia as if she were still the small child who had vanished so many years ago. At one point, she even pulled Yulia onto her lap, a tender gesture that revealed both her grief and her longing to make up for the lost years. Despite the joy of the reunion, Yulia's life remained firmly rooted in Russia. She chose to continue living in Ryazan, the city where she had grown up. There she shared a home with her boyfriend Ilya Kyukov and their daughter. Her adoptive life, though separate from her origins, remained deeply important to her. Still, the reconnection with her biological parents was not left behind. Yulia maintained regular contact with her family in Belarus, keeping the bond alive across borders. Although Yulia has no recollection of her disappearance, her adoptive parents told her that she used to remember a ride on a train with an unknown man and an unknown woman, sleepovers in abandoned buildings, begging and hiding from the police. Yulia's unknown companion left the girl at a train station in Ryazan. Her memories transformed him into a father figure, and therefore she was convinced her parents abandoned her. Yulia's life had a major turn, however. Every morning she receives text messages from Belarus. "Good morning to our daughter and granddaughter.